Is there a war on truth by Canada's military? It certainly appears so, according to a recent report which found the Canadian Forces Public Affairs Branch was paying over $1 million for training in the use of propaganda to influence public opinion. The company providing that was spawned off of Cambridge Analytica, the same one involved in the 2016 U.S. election and the Brexit vote. Hello and welcome to the Unpublished TV. I'm Ed Hand, your host for tonight's panel discussion. Our topic tonight, Canada's military and why it saw the need to use propaganda and technology to influence Canadians. However you're watching and listening to our show, whether through our social media channels on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, or on our podcast channels, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and more, I'd like to remind you, you can still cast your vote on this topic at unpublished.vote and then email your MP to tell them why. Now, the question, should the Canadian military be able to use propaganda to influence Canadians regarding public policy? And our viewers and listeners overwhelmingly said no. 96.2% said no. Just under 3% said yes. At unpublished.vote, you will find our podcast on this issue, as well as other articles and opinion pieces and research on the various views on Canada's military using propaganda on Canadians. So let's get started. Joining us this evening, Emma Bryant is a visiting research associate in human rights at Bard College in New York. David Berkeson is professor of military and diplomatic history at the University of Calgary. Marcus Kolga is a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and founder of DisinfoWatch. And Dave Scanlon is a retired Navy captain, former senior public affairs officer, 30-plus years in the military. And I want to thank our guests for showing up on the show tonight. We'll start with you first off, Dave. And, 30 years in PR. Did you ever have to use misinformation?
No. And I'd correct you there. 30 years in public affairs.
Yeah.
Public relations was a term that we used in the 50s and the 60s. And in the 50s and the 60s, the role of a public relations officer was to sell their service, to sell the Army, Navy, Air Force, and to defend them against criticism, frankly. We kind of moved out of that style after the Glasgow Commission in the 60s. And as we got into the 80s and 90s, our doctrine became pretty strict. And our doctrine was about truthful, timely, accurate information, promoting transparency, promoting accountability. And that's kind of where I was at through most of my career. So no, if I talk to you, I talk to somebody, you were getting the straight goods. Mm-hmm. I would be lying to say that there wasn't some advocacy. Obviously, I spent my life with the Navy and the Armed Forces. So there might be, an element of advocacy there. But my job ultimately is to promote informed public debate and help Canadian citizens make up their own minds. But my job is also to communicate to other audiences, right? We're not just talking friendly Canadian audiences, we're talking bad actors. And when a public affairs spokesperson goes out in Afghanistan, in Bosnia, in Libya, and they say, we're about to bomb you in Tripoli, that was a Canadian spokesperson and public affairs officer who led public information in the Libya campaign. When he spoke, he had to be credible. And the other side had to know that when he spoke, that his words were going to be, responded to, result in actions, tangible actions. So no, in answer to your question, no, my job was not to spin, not to lie, and I would never seek to misinform for a couple of reasons. Your trust in me would be broken immediately when you found out that I hadn't told you the truth, and I would be jeopardizing public trust. And public trust is ultimately what it's all about. And that's kind of what the conversation here we're having about right now is are we as an institution, the Canadian Forces, eroding public trust because the public are now going, wait a second, you guys are going to use this strategic communication stuff and these influence techniques on us in Canada? What's that about?
Okay, David, what do you think about that?
I agree completely. I was just shocked when I read the story. The use of the word propaganda really puts me off. I completely support the whole idea of the public affairs that is being done by the Canadian Forces and by the Department of National Defense. I worked with PA officers for many, many, many years. They've always been straight people. As one of the things I liked about the public affairs branch is that they believe that their mandate is to tell the truth, or as much of the truth as they are allowed to tell, given operational security and issues like that. but not to propagandize. I mean, Canadians don't need to be propagandized about their military. I think Canadians have a pretty high impression of their military anyway. And it's been a long, long time, since the early 90s, that we had any real problems with the military with the Somalia affair. And so I just don't understand why someone would take the chance to alienate people by using the word propaganda. I mean, what does that mean? Where does public affairs end and propaganda begin? Well, I think you know it when you see it. We don't need it, and I wouldn't like to see it. And I think I'm as pro-military preparedness as anybody in this country, and not for me.
Emma, you broke the story about Canada's military and its training. You say governments are failing us. How so?
Well, I mean, all countries around the world at the moment are tackling this issue of disinformation, and democracies are, experiencing an onslaught, both domestically, but also from, threats, international threats such as China, Russia, Iran. There are a lot of different sources out there of what we're calling propaganda. And militaries have to respond to this. And we're not in the same information environment that we were 20 years ago. Where we're talking about, the Gulf War and so on. Information travels around the world in, seconds, instantly. And how do you deal with that in the domestic context? This is a problem for militaries around the world. And I would say that the issue when it comes to Canada is that its strategic communications plans have not been developed as robust a way in recent times as they should have been. These are issues that no democracy should be having, frankly. Public affairs is meant to be about informing citizens about the actions of government, and to instigate an actual robust strategic communication plan where you have responses to foreign threats, and you have the need to communicate what you're doing as a military to domestic citizens. And you have to maybe sort of balance how much you can say to the domestic citizens against what your plans are strategically in relation to threats. This is a complex thing, especially in the modern information environment. And, foreign actors are very keen to operate in that domestic space. But how you respond to that as a democracy is crucial, because democracies have a hell of a lot more to lose by breaking the rules. Mm-hmm. And any good strategic communication strategy isn't about deploying the same kinds of methodologies as supposedly innovative or, allowing us flexibility against our own citizens. Actually, if you're doing that, you've lost the battle.
Marcus, is there a time and place where behavioral modifications, so things that the company from Cambridge Analytica was teaching, would that be used on the Canadian public? Is there a time and place for that?
I can't think of a single moment when that sort of a tactic and strategy should be used on the Canadian public. Surely, scraping social media to gather some sort of situational awareness, to understand the mood, as the Canadian military did just recently during the pandemic in the spring and summer, when our long-term care facilities required their assistance. They wanted to know what the mood was like in Ontario at the time, and that makes perfect sense in order to set up a strategic communications plan. I just want to pick up on what Emma said about strategic communications, and she's absolutely right. Canada is ill prepared for the ongoing information warfare that's happening. Our military is constantly facing propaganda attacks. Certainly our enhanced forward presence mission in Latvia. Our troops have been targeted there during the COVID crisis. There was disinformation that was being spread in the Russian language media in Latvia. suggesting that our troops were all sick with COVID and that they would be spreading it to the local population. There was an earlier story that used our defense minister, Harjit Sajjan, and the fact that he wears a turban. And the Russian language media in Latvia suggested that he was leading a jihadist army to take over Latvia. Another story had a picture of Russell Williams, convicted sex offender and killer. He was wearing women's lingerie, and the article suggested that he was leading a gay army to take over Latvia. These are the sorts of threats that we face, and those sorts of narratives undermine local trust in our mission there and in our forces. So, some training for sure is required, and I'm sure both Dave and David can attest to this. I mean, we need to fight back in those sorts of theaters where we're facing foreign adversaries and disinformation. And that goes for foreign disinformation that's attacking us here in Canada as well about our forces. The Russian media has clearly tried to plant stories in Canadian media as well about Latvia, about Ukrainians, that is intended to undermine Canada's missions in those countries. So there is a place for counter propaganda, but it certainly isn't. There isn't a place for when it targets our own citizens.
No, on our home soil. Let's just pick up Dave on information warfare and the mindset. Where does public affairs have to, I guess, change their tact right now?
Well, I agree with what everybody's saying here, and we face an entire spectrum here, right? A spectrum of information warfare and cyber warfare. So General John Vance, the Chief of Defense Staff, when he's thinking about this threat, he's not thinking about just public affairs. He's thinking about the full spectrum. And he's thinking about the ability of the armed forces to operate in places like Iraq and against a threat that can transcend that whole spectrum. All right. So that makes logical sense. If you're talking purely about public affairs, that's one piece of it. You still need that credible way to communicate. And by the way, the majority of information we put out is factual, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not easy. If you're going to put the front page of the New York Times out there or the front page of The Economist, there's a lot of thinking that goes into what information you put out, even factual information. And so you need a robust, capable organization that's good at doing that. But you also need other capabilities if you're going to be in places like Latvia or in places like Iraq. But I would kind of put emphasis on the fact that this is not just a military issue. This is a whole of government issue. If you're really going to tackle disinformation, you can't have the military over here in their corner fighting information warfare. It's got to be a whole of government thing. The other thing I'd say is about the public affairs side. I was kind of thinking about this earlier. I don't know if any Dirty Harry fans there. Clint Eastwood used to do the Dirty Harry movies. And the idea was for the cops to fight the bad guys, you had to have really bad cops, right? And that's kind of the temptation we're seeing right now in the disinformation environment, is that some think, hey, if we're going to compete in this environment, we have to be as good as they are at doing it. And that's a slippery slope. But another point, just put an accent on here, is I was just doing some research on public relations back, in the 50s and 60s. And I noticed that the 64 white paper talks about the major threat to Canada being from the air. This is intercontinental ballistic missiles and so on and so forth. Today, if you ask generals what they think the biggest threat is, they believe that future wars will be won and lost in the information space. And the terminology they have for this now is operations in the information environment. And that is a major and legitimate concern. And the Canadian forces rightly should be focused on that. And Canadian defense policy is rightly focused on that.
David, we've got a question coming in from one of our Facebook viewers right now. Should Canada use propaganda to counter propaganda, even in foreign countries, when our credibility is based on our honesty?
I don't believe that. And I want to say also that I don't think it's a role, the role that Dave is talking about. I don't think it's a role for the armed forces. It's a role for the communications security establishment, for example. It's a role for some special agency that's going to engage in information warfare on behalf of Canadians, but not a role for the military. I mean, what the military does, in my opinion, is it fights wars, it prepares to fight wars, it trains to fight wars. We've done a lot of work in this country since the mid-90s in producing one of the finest officer corps in the world, a very highly educated officer corps. We had people in this country during our operations in Afghanistan that were trying to pin the label of war criminals on our soldiers with no evidence whatsoever. But it wasn't up to the military to try to rebut that. In my opinion, it was up to the government to say, look, we've looked at this, we've examined this, we've looked at your evidence, we don't believe it, it's full of BS, and our soldiers there are not committing war crimes. And I think it's the same thing when we get this kind of propaganda in the Baltic region for a government agency to say, well, no, this is not going on. Harjit Singh is not a secret agent of the COVID forces. And but I don't think that's for the military to do. I think the military's job is very straightforward. It's much more complex today than it was 20 or 30 years ago for a lot of reasons. But I don't think it's up to the military to do it. I think it's just very simple. I think we need a special agency to do it, or we need CSE to do it, or some branch of CSE to do it.
Emma, okay, jump in, Dave.
But offer one quick comment. Yeah,
sure.
Agree with David. Whole of government. The only thing I would say is the Canadian forces still need the ability to integrate with coalition NATO forces overseas. And they have STRATCOM constructs and information operation constructs, which we need to be able to integrate into. So we need some better, but in principle, I agree with what David is saying. That is a whole government issue.
Emma, the method behavior modification, is it even effective? Like, I know we've seen the 2016 and Brexit.
Sorry. So I want to clearly distinguish here the methodology that was being taught by EMIC, and that was a methodology of Cambridge Analytica's parent company, SCL, who the staff of EMIC previously worked for, and the methodology that was deployed by Cambridge Analytica in American elections. Cambridge Analytica's methodology was specifically using social media data. The SCL methodology, known as behavioral dynamics, and which was being trained to the Canadian forces, is a different methodology. This is about behavioral modification, but it is utilizing a range of data that isn't necessarily social media data. And it's more about techniques of behavioral change. So I would say it's actually more sophisticated than what Cambridge Analytica were trying to do, which was modeling social media data based on personality traits, which actually isn't very useful in the context of warfare. And I would say, though, it's not more I would say that it's still a very unethical thing to be training public affairs staff with this particular methodology. And the British military had tested it twice and failed to prove that it was effective. So the Canadian military both paid $1 million for something that may not even work to train their forces, but also hired people from the parent company of Cambridge Analytica who had deployed this same methodology very unethically in elections. So there are a lot of problems with this particular company, conflicts of interest and all sorts of issues. The Senate Intelligence Committee in the United States actually produced a report a couple of months ago, which stated that Cambridge Analytica and SCL had interconnected staffing. And highlighted the data issues between these companies. So the defense side of SCL, the group of companies of which Cambridge Analytica were a part, were under active investigation. And I think that's really important to emphasize, particularly as that same Senate intelligence report, now that's a Republican-led Senate, also concluded that there was a degree of intersection between Cambridge Analytica and SCL and Russian intelligence services. So I think the fact that the Canadian military not only has this rash of concerning incidents that's taken place, but also didn't seem to have done due diligence enough to say, well, actually, maybe we'll wait until all these investigations have been resolved and we definitely know that this company is fine.
Yeah, that would have been handy.
Giving them $1 million. And by the way, they hired them twice, so I think this raises real big problems when it comes to training. Dave emphasized the importance of training, and I absolutely agree. And also Marcus, training is hugely important, and I think that's the issue here. Is that I don't think we can have faith in the training that's been done. And considering Canadians have paid so much money for training very few public affairs people, and by the way, this was public affairs individuals who are being trained,
yes, not
influence operations, and this is a methodology for PSYOPs that was utilized around the world for PSYOP. I think this raises real problems, and I think Canada needs to invest in proper training for its staff. And actually, I think the best people to be training Canadian public affairs are experienced Canadian public affairs officers. Why is Canada not building its own training facilities rather than hiring companies for exorbitant amounts of money who may not even have some innovative methodology that they're claiming to?
Now, Marcus, one other angle in that the report we're discussing here is collecting information on reporters, like creating a bit of a media chill, and I think it was Murray Brewster was highlighted clearly in that. What concerns do you have about that? Like we all know, and Dave, you mentioned it about reporters and public affairs, working it back and forth, but when you're starting to collect information on reporters for whatever reason, that's just not right.
No, absolutely. I think that a lot of public affairs, and I think Dave would be better off answering this, but my sense is that public affairs, whether you're in the public sector or private sector, but when you're working on public relations, you're going to want to keep some information about the reporters that you're in touch with and you're communicating with, the various beats of these reporters, and certainly the biases. All journalists, professional journalists, try not to have a bias, but everyone has their biases. So keeping that sort of basic information to me is not a big deal. But getting any further deeper into it, that would be a fairly deep concern. Just picking up a bit on what Emma was saying, our government here in Canada, they just released a report in March, the National Security and Intelligence Committee. This is an all-party committee of Parliament. In March of this year, unfortunately, it got buried by COVID, but they identified that information operations and propaganda were among the most serious threats coming from Russia and China that our democracy and society face today. And it was a 200-page report that basically outlined this threat in great detail using information from CSE and CSIS and other agencies. We have not yet, since the previous 2019 election, we have not put in place any measures to address this threat whatsoever. There's a group within Global Affairs that monitors disinformation, but that the disinformation attacks that they're monitoring, they're not going anywhere. They're ending up in a black hole. There's a G7 rapid reaction group, but Canadians themselves are not aware. We're in the dark, and the government is not spending they may be spending some resources thinking about it, but there is no concrete action that's happening. And some of what I'm seeing at DisinfoWatch, if you scratch beneath the surface, we've all talked about Chinese and Russian disinformation, the kind that we saw in 2016 before the presidential election. It's different now. It's far more sinister. What they're doing is they're using these COVID narratives and conspiracy theory narratives to further polarize us. And one of the things that I'm really concerned about with this specific story is that it is like crack cocaine to conspiracy theorists. The fact that the government and our armed forces might be setting up a propaganda operation to deceive Canadians is what feeds into these QAnon types of conspiracies. And those are the types of narratives that we're seeing, as I said before, pushing an already polarized population right now. And we're seeing it in the United States. It's pushing the left further to the left, the right further to the right. And that's where we're going to see conflict. And what's sort of ironic in all of that is that we may see down the road a need, like we've seen in the US over the past 3 to 4 months, where there's a conflict and a violent conflict where we may need the forces to step in. But like I said, the government right now isn't doing anything. So anything that we can be doing to train, whether it's within our forces or within our government, setting up some sort of infrastructure to deal with the problem, that's what we need to be doing right now.
Dave, I am wondering, is public affairs valued by the Canadian military, or would rather it disbanded? Because just sort of following up what David had said is maybe public affairs doesn't do this kind of thing. And,
Yeah, it's a fair question. Briefly, I know we're short on time. I'd say that
we're good.
Some view public affairs as, naive, simplistic, the doctrine of timely, truthful, accurate information. Well, guess what? We share that with the free press, and that's not a simplistic or easy doctrine, but there is a tendency not to recognize the strategic value of public affairs. And we talked about public trust as just one example. Just touching on a couple of the comments that other people have talked about. The mistake you make is that you become the story instead of telling the story. And that's kind of what's happened here with public affairs, right? Is they became the story. They should be the ones telling the story. And the other thing is, in terms of our relationship with the media and journalists, it tends to become personal. People start pointing fingers at particular journalists, and that's a mistake. I look at it from the Don Corleone thing. It's business. It's not personal. And I truly believe in the institution of the press. So when a defense reporter, and we tend to do this, we tend to isolate a certain defense reporter and blame them. Well, guess what? That defense reporter has the backing of the institution of the press, the backing of the Ottawa Citizen, the backing of CBC News, the backing of the New York Times. It's just not some individual that's out there. And we make that mistake and we make it personal, and we shouldn't. We should respect it. And of all the organizations in Canada that should be promoting our Charter of freedom and rights, which includes freedom of the press, it probably should be the armed forces.
David, this all falls under John Vance's leadership, and obviously he's retiring, or announced his retirement in July. I just wonder, how does this impact his reputation?
I don't think it's going to impact it very much, because it comes, as you were saying, pretty well at the end of his career. Yeah, $1 million is a lot to me, I can tell you that. It's not a lot to the defense budget. Every now and then, the best of us have ideas that we should probably keep inside our head. And I've got a lot of respect for John Vance, and I think that maybe this is just one of those areas where somebody just goes off the playing field, and probably should have thought twice about it. And I just don't think it's going to impact him. He made his reputation in Afghanistan, and it was well made.
I just following up on protocol, would because it seemed that the defense minister was a little in the dark about what was going on. Would there not been more communication between the two?
Well, you would have thought so. I mean, because the CDS is the chief military advisor to the Minister of National Defense and the Prime Minister, most especially the Prime Minister, but of course the MND is part of that. And so if there was a miscommunication in there, it's hard to see why it would have happened, because the lines of communication are usually pretty well drawn at those top levels.
Emma, you made this the discovery, and the Canadian military is cleaning up after it now. But I'm wondering, you a couple of times you mentioned democracies, being targeted, democracies being targeted. Who has got it right now in terms of what we're dealing with here?
I don't know. I think a lot of governments are struggling. I wouldn't say anyone has particularly got it right. I would say that perhaps strategic communication is being done more effectively in in other places, but that doesn't mean that there is anybody who doesn't have occasional issues when it comes to things that weren't perhaps the best strategy at the time. And I would say I could point to various different scandals in the United States and the UK, which are my two main specializations. But, I mean, I would say that they do have more developed doctrine when it comes to this area. And I think that's really important. What you need is to, have it clearly laid down, what the protocol and processes are that different, actors working in the information space need to be following, and how they are interrelated and are supposed to be working together or not together, and who should be responding in what way. So you need this to be very, very clearly drawn out, and that is not the case at the moment. I mean, the draft policies that I've seen were very concerning to me, and they really were not clear. And how officers would be expected to follow this and to know, to be expected to be doing everything right would be, beyond me, I think. I mean, it really was quite poor. So I think, this needs to go back to the drawing board. But I think actually all countries are struggling to respond to these disinformation threats, and that's not a small challenge. I think how we move forward, though, isn't just about military responses. And I think that's really important to say, that yes, the military needs to be thinking about this very carefully and planning, like Marcus said. But there are a lot of different actors that can be, brought to bear on the domestic disinformation, and civil society responses, like Marcus's initiative, are really important as well. So we need to not just think of this as a military problem. Actually, it's not just a whole of government issue, it's a whole of society problem that we all need to be thinking about.
Marcus, the one thing when I read this story, I ran it over, the first thing, and it's still the last thing that's gone through my head, is credibility. How can the Canadian Forces have any credibility knowing that there's a report out there that said they've obviously wanted to learn how to use propaganda on the people?
Well, it's going to take some time to repair that credibility. I also do think that they can repair this. This is, I think we need to take all of this with a grain of salt. I think there are facts floating out there, and what we need to do is have a proper investigation into this, into the situation. What was that training about? Who did it affect? I know there was this story about an exercise in Nova Scotia. I think that seems to be a sidebar to all of this. I think it's fairly safe to say that it was probably a psychological operations training operation with some very effective props. Some of them got leaked out into the public. I'm not sure that they were really going to scare an entire town into thinking that there's a pack of wolves coming to take their babies. But this the situation with regards to using propaganda to influence our own people, I mean, this is something we need to look into. Parliament might consider, the Standing Committee on National Defence might look into this, and there are positives that can come out of this. We can maybe look at a proper strategic communications plan, investigate how the armed forces are looking at and how they're addressing the threat of foreign disinformation. These are the sorts of things that we need to start doing, and certainly an investigation is warranted into this.
David, and just looking at this was just to wind up the credibility. How can the forces get their credibility back?
Well, I don't think the forces have lost their credibility. I mean, this is clearly a speed bump. And I think they've got to get over it. I think the reaction has been so negative to this that somebody there is going to think twice, if not John Vance before he leaves, or whoever his successor is. So, I think things will calm down. And basically, the Canadians do have a lot of trust in their military. they don't want to spend a lot of money on their military, but they do trust their military. So I think this will go away pretty quickly. But then again, I'm not on Twitter, I'm not on Facebook deliberately. And so what goes on in the social media goes right over my head, and I sleep well every night.
Yeah, I was going to say you must sleep well at night. Folks, I want to thank you all for joining us. Very interesting conversation. Our guest tonight on Unpublished TV, Emma Bryant, Visiting Research Associate in Human Rights at Bard College. David Berkeson, Professor of Military Diplomatic History, the University of Calgary. Marcus Kolga, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and the founder of DisinfoWatch. And Dave Scanlon also joining us, 30 years public affairs with the Canadian military, retired Navy. Coming up on the next Unpublished Ottawa, we have 2 vaccines with reportedly 90% efficacy. Have we turned the corner in the pandemic? Thanks for watching Unpublished TV. Stay safe. I'm Ed Hand.